I have been cleaning the same corridor for 19 years. I want to say that plainly, at the start, before everything else. Not because I am proud of it. I am, I suppose, in the way. A man is proud of any work done honestly and without complaint. But because the people, who will eventually write about what happened in sub-level 3 of the Kelder Research Annex, will spend a great deal of time on the beacon itself, on its age, on its crystalline lattice and its brushed iron housing, and the 8,000-year silence that preceded the morning it woke. They will write about the researchers who came from 14 countries, the instruments that failed, the grant applications and the published papers and the theoretical frameworks that were quietly abandoned when the beacon declined to cooperate. They will not write much about the man who mopped the floor in front of it every morning at 5:45. That is fine. I am not asking for a monument. I am asking only that the record be accurate because I have learned, slowly, over 19 years, in a sub-basement corridor on the southwestern tip of Iceland, that accuracy is a form of care. And care, as it turns out, is the thing the beacon was waiting for. My name is Edvard Sull. I am 58 years old. My mother was Swedish, my father Icelandic, and I have been a maintenance technician for Kelder University's Facilities Division since I was 39, when my back gave out on the fishing vessels and I needed work that kept me indoors. I am not a scientist. I hold no advanced degrees. I read widely and remember most of what I read, which means I know a little about a great many things, is different from knowing a great deal about anything in particular. I spent 13 years on the sea before I spent 19 years underground, and I will tell you that both of them teach the same lesson if you pay attention. The work you do in the absence of witnesses is the work that keeps things whole. I am not telling you this to seem humble. I am telling you because what happened should make sense given what I actually am, rather than what people would prefer me to be. The Kelder Research Annex was not always a university building. It was constructed in 2031 on the site of a former geothermal monitoring station, when the Icelandic government transferred stewardship of the beacon to the university consortium. After 40 years of largely fruitless government study, the transfer was described, at the time, as a gesture of scientific openness. The more honest assessment circulates freely in the maintenance division is that the government grew tired of paying for an object that did nothing and explained nothing, and sat in its sub-basement with the quiet patience of something that had all the time in the world. The beacon was discovered in 1991 during expansion of the original geothermal monitoring station. Crew drilling a secondary intake shaft broke through a layer of compressed basalt into a sealed chamber 31 meters below the surface. The chamber was not natural. The walls were too smooth, the geometry too deliberate, the air inside stale but not foul, as though it had been sealed, trapped. The seal was intact. Whatever had closed that chamber 8,000 years ago had held against the slow grind of the Reykjanes Peninsula, its geothermal shifts, its minor seismic events, the patient creep of groundwater through ancient volcanic rock, and held perfectly. In the center of the chamber stood the beacon. It is roughly 2 meters tall and 40 centimeters in diameter. The outer housing is a metal none of the laboratories have been able to fully categorize. Broadly iron in composition, extraordinarily dense, with a surface that resists corrosion in a way that no known alloy should after 8 millennia of contact with Icelandic groundwater. Housing has no seam, no hinge, no visible mechanism. Running from base to apex in a continuous helical path is a channel, a groove roughly 3 centimeters wide, through which, in the first photographs, you can see the interior. A lattice of something crystalline, pale green in color, shot through with filaments. So faint, they are barely visible without magnification. The crystal does not match any known mineral structure. Filaments have never been successfully sampled. Every instrument that has attempted contact has been deflected, not damaged. Deflected, as though the crystal simply declined to be touched. In 40 years of government study, the beacon produced no reading, no emission, no response to any input. It tolerated light, sound, electromagnetic pulses, temperature variation, presence of every material scientists thought to bring near it. It tolerated all of it with exactly the same response. Nothing. It sat. It waited. Refused. The first government team had been young, full of theories. They tried radio frequencies. They tried ultraviolet light. They tried a man who claimed to have a sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, who stood before the beacon for 40 minutes, and then asked if there was somewhere he could sit down. They tried a specialist in xenocrephery who had been consulted on a signals analysis project, and who spent 3 weeks developing a mathematical framework for contact. He published a well-regarded paper and left with the same result. The beacon had not cooperated. By the time the consortium inherited it, the tone of the research literature had shifted from excitement to a kind of cautious patience that is indistinguishable from the outside from resignation. The papers used phrases like long-cycle dormancy threshold and passive registration mode. They meant it does nothing, and we no longer expect it to, but we are still here and we want the grant renewed. When the university consortium took stewardship, they built the annex around the original structure. They bored new access tunnels. They installed climate control, seismic isolation, vibration dampeners. They built the subbasement corridor with finished walls and sealed flooring and overhead strips of cool white light that run the length of the passage. The beacon sits at the far end of the corridor in its original chamber. Now opened and integrated into the building, you can walk right up to it, within 2 meters, which is the designated approach boundary, marked by a low rail of brushed aluminium. I started at Kelder the year the annex opened. First day on sublevel 3, my supervisor, a small serious woman named Dagny who has since retired, walked me down the corridor, showed me the beacon and told me what I was not to do. Do not cross the rail. Do not touch the housing. Do not bring food or drink within 5 meters. Keep the corridor dry. The climate control maintains 12 degrees Celsius and 40% relative humidity, and the sensors are sensitive, so any spill that affects the ambient moisture has to be reported. Keep the floor free of particulates. The research teams bring their own monitoring equipment, and they need a clean baseline. I asked her what the thing was. She said, "Nobody knows. 8,000 years old, minimum. Alien almost certainly." The basalt seal above it was dated independently 3 times, and all 3 estimates agreed on the range. The government people thought it was a communications device. The university people are not sure. It doesn't communicate. It doesn't do anything. It just sits there and refuses. I asked her if that bothered her. She thought about it and said, no. She said she had cleaned rooms that held things much less cooperative than a quiet cylinder. She said my job was the corridor, not the beacon, and to make sure the mop was fully wrung out before it touched the sealed floor, because the moisture sensors were calibrated to 0.1%, and the research lead on the current grant cycle was not a forgiving man. That was the beginning. For the first several months, I was merely careful. I kept the corridor clean. I checked the seals around the chamber door. I replaced the HEPA filters on the corridor's intake vents on the schedule Dagny had established. I reported anomalies. A condensation drip from an overhead pipe fitting, floor tile that had developed a hairline crack along its grout, a vibration sensor that read slightly high on Tuesdays, turned out to be a delivery truck that parked near the building's east wall every Tuesday morning. I was thorough, and I was quiet, and I stayed on my side of the aluminium rail. But a man who works alone in a corridor for 5 hours every morning eventually begins to pay attention. The beacon, I noticed, had a film on it. A heavy film. Not grime or corrosion. I told you the housing resisted both. It was a thin deposit of particulates. The ordinary atmospheric dust that finds its way into every sealed environment, regardless of filters, plus what I can only describe as a mineral bloom. A faint chalky residue that crept up the outside of the housing from the base, drawn by some capillary action I couldn't name from the contact between the iron casing and the thin layer of geothermal mineral-rich water that perpetually migrated up through the concrete plinth the beacon stood on. The university had sealed the plinth twice with raw resin. The mineral migration came back both times. The beacon simply drew it up, slowly the way old stone draws moisture. I'd seen the same thing on the harbor walls back in the fishing years. Ancient stone that pulled the sea into itself, regardless of what was painted over it, as though the material had an opinion about what it wanted to be in contact with. The research teams cleaned their instruments. They cleaned their sensors. They cleaned the rail and the floor. and the approach zone within the rail. No one cleaned the beacon itself. It was outside the rail, technically under the stewardship of the maintenance division. No one in the maintenance division had ever been instructed to touch it, so no one had. I raised it with my supervisor at the time. Dagny had retired and been replaced by a man named Benedict, younger than me, thorough, but not imaginative. I told him the housing a film and asked if I should clean it. He asked me what the research lead said. I said I hadn't asked the research lead. He said to ask the research lead. The research lead at the time was a Swedish physicist named Haraldsson. I found him in the corridor one Thursday when he was running a new baseline scan, and I asked him, very plainly, whether maintenance was permitted to clean the exterior of the beacon's housing. He looked at me for a moment, as though the question had arrived from a direction he hadn't expected. He said, "It doesn't do anything. It won't matter." I said I understood that. I was asking whether it was permitted, he said. If it doesn't cross any of the monitoring thresholds, yes, fine. Use something dry. Do not apply any solvent or compound to the housing surface. I said I understood. I went back to the storage room and found a cloth. A clean one, lint-free microfiber, the kind we used on the glass panels in the upper corridors. I brought it down to sublevel 3 the following Monday. And before I started my regular cleaning pass, I stepped up to the rail and reached across it, carefully, staying behind the rail with my feet, and ran the cloth along the side of the beacon's housing. The surface was cold, dense in the way of something that has been stable for a very long time, the cold that gets into old stone and old iron and stays there, not because the environment around it is cold, though the corridor was 12 degrees, because the thing itself has accumulated cold across years too many to think about comfortably. It was the cold of something that pre-existed the building around it, the city above it, the civilization that had built both. I held the cloth against it for a moment before I moved it, and I was aware of that cold going into my hand the way cold goes into you when you grip something old and still. Then I moved the cloth and did the work. It took me 3 Mondays to clean the whole thing, working in sections, reaching around the helical channel with the cloth folded small, so as not to catch on the edges. Inside the channel was visible, as I worked past each section of the groove, pale green, still, catching the white overhead light in a way that made it look like it was holding the light, rather than merely reflecting it. I noticed, in those first 3 sessions, that the crystal was not uniform. The filaments I had read about in the published papers were not visible to me with my eye at a cloth's distance, but the lattice itself had variation, areas of different density, different opacity, different depth of color. It looked less like a fabricated material than like something that had grown. Not organically, not biologically, but in the way that crystal grows when given sufficient time and stability. As though it had been placed here to do exactly that, to be given time and stability, to grow into whatever it was meant to become. I had no theory about this. I am not a scientist, and I was not drawing conclusions. I was cleaning the thing. I am simply telling you what I noticed. When I was done, the housing was clean. The mineral film was gone. The brushed iron surface had a particular quality in the light. Not bright, not polished, present. Clear. Haraldsson came down that Thursday and ran his scan and said nothing about the housing. His monitors read as they always had. Nothing had changed. Of course nothing had changed. It was a clean surface versus a filmed surface. I had not done anything remarkable. I had cleaned the thing I was responsible for, which is what maintenance workers do. I started doing it every month. Not on any schedule I announced or logged formally. It was simply part of my Monday routine. I did the corridor floor. I checked the vents. I replaced whatever needed replacing, and I wiped down the beacon. 3 passes: base, middle section, and apex, rotating around it slowly in the narrow space between the housing and the chamber wall, cloth folded fresh for each section. It took perhaps 20 minutes. It disturbed nothing. It changed nothing, as far as anyone's instruments could determine. That was how it went for years. Research teams cycled through. Haraldsson's grant ended and a German team took over, then a joint Norwegian-British consortium, then a rotating panel from the European Space Research Cooperative, who came in 2-week rotations and spoke to me only to confirm I had signed in at the access log. I signed in at the access log. I cleaned the corridor. I cleaned the beacon. They scanned and measured and published papers I sometimes read in the evenings, papers that used phrases like epistemically sealed and non-responsive to all known contact protocols and whose conclusions invariably circled back to the same holding position. The object remains dormant. No change has been observed. I read those papers without particular feeling. They were accurate as far as they went. The beacon was dormant. No change had been observed. What had not been observed was not the same as what had not happened. I am going to tell you something that will sound, in the telling, more deliberate than it was. I am going to tell you about the temperature, and the Cecils, and the mineral migration, and the way I came to understand the beacon's environment over 19 years. And it will sound, perhaps, like a project, like a plan. I want to be honest. It was not. It was just the work. It was just what you do when you are responsible for a place and you pay attention. The climate control in sublevel 3 was designed to maintain 12 degrees Celsius and 40% relative humidity. These were the parameters the original government scientists had established as a conservative baseline. Cold enough to slow any potential organic processes, dry enough to prevent condensation on the monitoring instruments. They were, as far as the university knew, arbitrary. The beacon had never indicated a preference for anything. But I worked in that corridor every morning. And in that corridor, the climate control unit had a cycling behavior, a small periodic oscillation in temperature between 11.4 and 12.6 degrees Celsius over a roughly 90-minute window that the monitoring reports flagged as within spec and therefore ignored. It was within spec. Over years, I had noticed that the mineral migration up the plinth slowed, almost stopped. When the corridor held steady at 12.1 degrees and accelerated when it dipped below 11.8. I did not know why. I am not a material scientist. I simply noticed. I also noticed that, on the days following a temperature dip below 11.8, the crystal in the helical channel looked different. Not dramatically different. I would not have noticed it at all in the early years, when I did not know the beacon's variations well enough to read them. But by year 6, I knew that lattice the way you come to know a face you have seen every day, not because you studied it, but because you were simply there, and being there long enough makes things legible. On the dip days, the crystal was marginally duller, less of that quality I mentioned. The light-holding quality, more simply reflective, less interior. I mentioned the temperature observation to a facilities engineer who came through for a systems audit in my 9th year. She looked at the data I had written down. I kept a small notebook, nothing official, just my own observations in my own handwriting, dated. And she said that was interesting, and she would note it in her report. Port recommended the climate system be recalibrated to a tighter tolerance band. It was. The oscillation was reduced to within 0.2 of a degree. The mineral migration slowed further. The research teams noticed the reduction in mineral deposit on the plinth. They published a brief note on it, attributed to the recalibration, which was correct. They did not note the 9 months of observation that had prompted the recalibration request. The facilities engineer had noted it in her internal report. It did not make the published literature. These things happen. The seals around the chamber door were replaced on a manufacturer-recommended cycle of 5 years. I had noticed, by year 11, that the seal on the lower left corner of the door frame was degrading faster than the others. A consequence of foot traffic vibration, I thought, since that corner was closest to the walking path, and took the indirect shudder of every person who moved through the corridor with any speed. I replaced it at 3.5 years on my own initiative and informed Benedict afterward. I replaced all 4 corners at 4 years. The research team never knew the seals had been changed on a different schedule. They did not need to know. The environment held. In year 14, I noticed that the intake vents on the south wall were pulling particulates unevenly, more from the access stair end of the corridor than from the chamber end. This created a mild directional flow that on certain days deposited more atmospheric material on the south-facing side of the beacon's housing than on the north. I adjusted the vent baffles. The correction took 40 minutes and a screwdriver. The monitoring data shows a negligible change in particulate distribution after that date, though no one has flagged it as significant in any published work. I am telling you this because it matters. Telling you this because what the beacon responded to, eventually, was not an experiment, was not a credential, was not an instrument or a theory or a published framework. What it responded to was the accumulated weight of small, recorded acts of care, the kind that leave no byline, no citation, no credit, the kind that happen in corridors at 5:45 in the morning when everyone else is still in bed. 8,000 years is a long time to wait for the right kind of attention. The morning it woke was the 14th of March. I know this precisely because I had replaced the HEPA filters on the south intake vent the previous Friday and had written the date in my notebook, and the beacon woke on the Monday following, which was the 14th. I know this is probably not a causal connection. I am simply reporting the sequence. I arrived at 6:11 that morning. I was running slightly late. My bus had been delayed, and I had not had time to finish my coffee, so I came down the access stairs with my thermos in my left hand and my maintenance bag over my right shoulder, already mentally running through the morning sequence. The corridor lights came on automatically as I stepped off the bottom stair, as they always did. The beacon was lit, not with the overhead corridor lights, not with anything I recognized. The lattice inside the helical channel was glowing, a pale, cold green, the same green I had seen the light catch in it all those years, now from inside, from itself. A thin line of it running the full length of the chancel from base to apex, steady, not pulsing, not flickering, just on. I stood at the foot of the stairs for what I think was about 30 seconds. Then I set my thermos down on the stair landing, hung my bag on the hook by the door, and walked down the corridor to the monitoring station. A small desk with a permanent display unit that logged all environmental readings. The readings were within normal parameters. Temperature, 12.1 degrees. Humidity, 40%. Seismic, flat. Vibration, nominal. Every instrument in the corridor was reading normal, except there was light coming out of the beacon that had not been there before. I walked to the access log and signed in. Then I took out my phone and photographed the beacon from the corridor side. 3 photographs, from different positions, so the light in the channel was clear in each one, and a researcher could orient to the images without difficulty. Then I called Benedict. He did not answer. It was 6:15 in the morning. I kiffed a message, sub-level 3. The beacon has illuminated. I have photographs. Nothing in the monitoring array has triggered. I'm in the corridor now. I hung up and stood there with my phone in my hand. The beacon continued to glow, steady, patient. The green light was not harsh. It was the color of light through old sea glass, or the aurora when it comes low and slow on a clear winter night over the Reykjanes plain. I had lived on that peninsula long enough to know that color. I had watched it from the deck of a fishing vessel in the years before my back failed, standing in the cold with my hands on the rail, and the ocean below me, and that slow green wash across the sky above, and what I had always thought. Watching it was not a poetic thought. It was simply the thought that this is something that does not need me to watch it. It would be here if I weren't. It will be here when I'm gone, and yet here I am, watching it, and there is something right about that too. The beacon had that quality. Watching it in the corridor that morning, I had the clear sense that the light in its channel was not for me, was not performing, was simply present in the way that the aurora is present, existing in its own terms, indifferent to whether it is witnessed, but available to be witnessed nonetheless. I went to the supply closet, got my equipment, and started the corridor floor. If the beacon was going to do something, it would do it whether I stood and watched or whether I worked. And the floor needed doing. Benedict arrived at 7:04, slightly out of breath, accompanied by Dr. Lena Voss, the current research lead, a Danish astrophysicist, serious and careful, who had been running the European Consortium's rotation for 14 months, and who I had spoken to, perhaps a dozen times, always briefly, always about corridor protocols. She came down the access stairs ahead of Benedict, saw the beacon's light, and stopped so suddenly that Benedict nearly ran into her back. She stood there for a long moment. Then she walked down the corridor slowly, stopping well short of the rail, and looked at the channel light from 3 meters away. She said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "It's actually doing it." She was followed. Within 20 minutes, by 2 of her team members, chained, and within 40 by 3 more who had been called from the annex's upper floors. By 8 o'clock, there were 11 people in sublevel 3, and I had finished the floor and moved on to the intake vents. Dr. Voss ran every instrument the consortium had available. She ran them one at a time, and then in combination. She and her team moved around the beacon's perimeter, staying behind the rail, as protocol required, adjusting sensor positions, running signal sequences, speaking to each other in low, precise voices about what the readings showed. Which was, as far as I could tell from my position at the vents, very little. The instruments registered the light. They could not characterize it. The spectral signature was outside the calibrated range of every detector they brought to it. The light itself produced no measurable emission beyond the visible band. No heat, no radiation, no electromagnetic output the sensors could quantify. It simply shone. A crystallographer arrived before noon and examined the visible portion of the lattice through a long arm lens assembly mounted over the rail. I heard him say twice that the internal structure had changed, that the filament density was different from the baseline photographic. His baseline was 4 years old, which was the last time someone had photographed the crystal in detail through the channel. I did not say anything about this. I was replacing a filter housing on the north vent, and it was not my place to say anything about it. At 9:47, Dr. Voss tried speaking to it. I know this sounds unscientific. She knows this too, she told me later. The particular candor of someone who is used to defending her methods in peer review, that she had tried everything else, and the alternative was standing there, doing nothing, which she found professionally untenable. She spoke in Danish, then English, then what she described as a sequence of prime number intervals, rendered as spoken intervals and single syllables, protocol developed by the Norwegian team in 2038 and published in 3 journals as the most mathematically rigorous first contact attempt yet undertaken at this site. The beacon continued to glow. It did not respond. At 11:15, a representative from the Icelandic Ministry of Research arrived. At noon, a security perimeter was established at the top of the sublevel 3 access stairs. I had my lunch at the monitoring desk because I could not leave the corridor during active access. My maintenance division credential was one of keys required to lock down the corridor if needed, and Benedict asked me to stay. I stayed. The afternoon brought more people. A signal theorist from the British Space Research Institute, who set up a portable antenna array in the corridor and ran frequency sweeps for 90 minutes. A linguist, not say a xenolinguist, because that is not a credentialed discipline, but a linguist who had consulted on previous beacon research and who played a sequence of synthesized tones through a directional speaker aimed at the channel. A physicist from Reykjavik University who brought a portable spectrometer and spent 40 minutes confirming what everyone already knew. The emission was real, and it fell outside every calibrated range they had. The beacon glowed. It did not respond to any of them. What I noticed, over the course of the day, was something none of the instruments was measuring. The light in the channel did not remain entirely static. There was a quality to it that changed in relation to who was in the corridor. Not in a way you could put a number on, not in a way the instruments were capturing. But I had been reading that crystal for 17 years the way you read the sky before a sea change, and I could see that the light was different when the corridor was full of people with instruments than it was at 6:15 when I was the only person there. Fuller when I was alone with it. Quieter when the crowd pressed forward with their equipment, as though the presence of instruments, of things designed to extract, created a kind of withdrawal. I did not say this to anyone. I am a maintenance technician, and it is not my place to characterize the behavior of research subjects to the researchers. I only put it in the notebook. At 4:30, Dr. Voss called a pause. People stepped back from the rail, found spaces along the corridor wall, drank from water bottles, spoke quietly. She walked to the monitoring desk and looked at the environmental log, and then looked at me. She said, "How long have you been here?" I said, "Since 6:11. She said, "You were here when it started." I said, "Yes." She said, "What happened? What changed? Was there anything different this morning?" I thought about it. I said, "I was slightly late. My bus was delayed. I hadn't finished my coffee." She looked at me for a moment. She said, Was the beacon lit when you came in? I said yes. She said, did anything trigger when it lit? Any of the sensors? I said, nothing. I checked the monitoring display immediately. Everything was within normal parameters. She nodded slowly. She said, it's been 8,000 years. Every instrument we have, every signal we've tried, every theoretical framework, and it wakes up on a Monday morning with no trigger, no anomaly, nothing. And then it just sits there and glows. I said, yes, that appears to be what it's doing. She looked down the corridor at the beacon. The green light was unchanged, same intensity, same steadiness it had held since 6:11. 11 hours, she said. Mr. Sull, what do you actually do in this corridor? I told her. All of it. The floor, the vents, the seals, the filters, the monthly cleaning of the housing, the temperature observations, and the note I had given the facilities engineer. The seal replacement schedule I had adjusted. The vent baffle correction in year 14. I told her plainly and without emphasis, the way I would describe a maintenance routine to anyone who asked, because that is what it was. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Corridor was also quiet. The pause had brought the whole team to a rest, and most of them were close enough to have heard everything I said, though none of them were looking at me. Then she said, you've been cleaning the housing itself? The exterior of the casing? I said yes. Every month. Approximately 17 years, she said. That's not in any maintenance protocol I've seen. I said it wasn't. I had asked Dr. Haraldson for permission in the early years, and he had said fine, use something dry. I had used something dry. I had not sought further authorization, because no one had told me to stop, and the monitoring thresholds had never been triggered, she said. Dry cloth? No compounds, I said. Lint-free microfiber. Nothing on it, just the cloth, she said. 17 years. I said yes. She was quiet again. I could see her thinking. Not reacting. Thinking. There is a difference, and she was clearly a person who knew the difference. She was not looking at me with the expression of someone reassessing a situation. She was looking at me with the expression of someone adding a variable to a framework that was not yet complete. She said she would need to think about this. She walked back toward the beacon and stood outside the rail, looking at it. The green light moved in the channel in a way I had not noticed before. Not a pulse exactly, but a very slow shimmer, like the movement of a northern light when the solar wind is gentle. It was subtle enough that you could convince yourself you had imagined it. I watched her watch the beacon. Then I picked up my cloth and my maintenance bag and I walked down the corridor toward it, because I had not done the monthly wipe yet. I had been late this morning, and had not gotten to it before the corridor filled with people. I did not think about whether it was a good moment. I simply noticed that it had not been done, and that it needed doing. Heard someone behind me say my name. Benedict, I think, warning in his voice. But I was already at the rail, and what I did was what I always did. I reached across the rail with the cloth folded flat in my hand, and I laid it against the housing. The beacon went silent. Not dark, silent. Every person in that corridor had been talking in quiet, careful voices for 10 hours, and in the moment I touched the cloth to the housing, all of them stopped. I felt it before I heard it. The absence of noise, as though the air itself had paused. The green light in the channel intensified, not brighter in the sense of harsher, deeper. The pale sea glass color went the dark, rich green of deep water. The green of the ocean floor, where no light ordinarily reaches but where, sometimes, the abyssal vents produce their own. The shimmer I had thought I was imagining became unmistakable. A slow wave ascending the channel from base to apex, rising and fading and rising again, deliberate as breathing. I held the cloth against the housing and I did not move. My hand was on a surface that was, under the cloth, iron, dense, cold, slightly rough in the way of old metal that has been stable for a very long time. I had touched it 190 times, give or take. I knew the texture the way I know the handle of my own front door. There was nothing new in the physical contact. My hand knew this surface. And perhaps, I thought, standing there, trying not to think too much, trying simply to hold still and do the thing I had always done. Perhaps that was exactly the point. The wave in the channel reached the apex and stayed there. A bright point of green at the very top of the beacon, the full 2 meters of it washed in that deep rising color. And then the glyphs appeared. There are no glyphs on the beacon. There are no markings on the exterior housing at all. The surface is smooth except for the helical channel. I had cleaned it long enough to know every millimeter of it. There were no glyphs. There were glyphs now. They appeared in sequence around the housing, not carved, not raised, but glowing, the same deep green as the channel light, appearing and holding, and then joined by the next and the next. They ran in a band around the upper third of the housing, 8 or 10 characters, arranged in a line that wrapped the circumference. I did not know what they were. I have never claimed to know what they were. No one in that corridor, including the linguist, knew what they were. What I knew was that they were calm. In the same way a face can be calm, in the way a sentence can be calm. There was nothing frantic in the way they appeared. They were not urgent. They were not alarmed. They appeared the way words appear when someone has been waiting to say something for a very long time and has finally decided it is the right moment. Behind me I could hear the corridor. I could hear the sound of 11 people trying not to make a sound, held breath, slight movement of feet on floor, the quiet strain of people who wanted to speak but understood. Somehow, that speaking was wrong. I did not move my hand. The glyph band completed its circle. The deep green of the channel held its intensity. The bright point at the apex remained, and then the beacon spoke. I do not have adequate vocabulary for what that was. I am 58 years old, and I have heard many things. My children's voices when they were born, my mother's voice the last time I spoke to her, the sound of the ocean in a storm on the Reykjanes coast, the sound of deep quiet in a sub-basement corridor at 5:45 in the morning when you are the only person in the building. I know what it is to hear something that gets into you before you have decided to let it in. The sound was not loud. It was not a voice in the way a human voice, a voice of a voice. It had no body behind it, no throat producing it, no chest resonating it. It was sound organized into speech the way ice organizes itself into pattern, inevitably, completely, with no effort visible in the result. It did not come from a speaker. It did not come from a direction. It came from the beacon, the way warmth comes from something that has been carrying heat for a very long time and has finally allowed it to release. It said 6 words. I know because I have been asked many times now to reproduce them, that the words themselves are not a surprise, that there is a version of this story, the version that starts with an ancient alien artifact in a sub-basement and ends with a recognition, where the words are obvious, where a person hearing the story might think, yes, of course, it said something like that, of course. But you have not heard those words at the end of a sub-basement corridor with your hand on iron and 11 people behind you who have stopped. Breathing, it said. You kept the light, keeper. Not loudly, not with the theatrical weight of a pronouncement. The simple completeness of a statement that had been true for a very long time, and was now, at last, being said aloud. I stood there with my cloth against the housing, and I did not say anything. The glyph band pulsed once, a single bright wave around the circumference, and then held steady. Behind me, Lena Voss said something in Danish that I did not understand. Then she said in English, very quietly, Mr. Sull, don't move. I was not going to move. I want to try to tell you what it felt like, and I want to be honest that I am not sure I can. There are experiences in a life that arrive fully formed and do not require interpretation. The moment a child is born, the moment you understand that someone you love is not coming back. The moment you stand in a place you have never been before and know, without being able to explain why, that you belong there. Standing with my hand on that housing, with those words still in the corridor air, and the deep green light moving above my hand, and 11 people behind me in absolute silence. It was not triumph, it was not wonder exactly. It was the particular, quiet feeling of something being completed. The sensation of a thing that has been almost finished for a very long time, that has waited with the patience of something that does not experience patience as effort, finally reaching its last moment and coming to rest. I thought about the cloth in my hand. I thought about the first time I had reached across that rail, the borrowed microfiber cloth, question I had asked Haraldson, the answer that amounted to, it doesn't matter, go ahead. I thought about the notebook on my desk upstairs. The temperature observations written in my ordinary handwriting, the replacement schedule for the lower left seal. I thought about the facilities engineer and her report and the citation that had noted the recalibration without noting the observation that had prompted it. I thought about my mother, who had kept an immaculate house not because she thought anyone was watching, but because she believed the things you tend to become, over time, what they are tended to be. She had no theory about it. It was simply what she did. She kept the wood clean, and the windows clear, and the small garden behind the house in Gothenburg ordered and cared for, not because it changed the world or earned her anything, but because neglect has its own momentum and so does care. And she had chosen one of them, and she had been consistent. She died 11 years ago. I had thought about her in this corridor before, in the early mornings, before anyone else arrived, in the way that a quiet space brings certain people back to you. I was thinking about her now, with the beacon's light around my hand and its words still in the air, because she was the one who had taught me that care is not something you form for an audience. You do it because the thing requires it. You do it because the thing is there, and it is your responsibility, and because, here is the part she never said aloud though, she demonstrated it every day, because somewhere in the simple fact of continuing, there is a kind of faith, not religious faith. The faith that says, the effort is not wasted, that something is always listening, or will listen, was listening long ago, and is only now able to say so. I withdrew the cloth from the housing. The glyph band remained. The channel light remained at its deep green. The point at the apex remained bright. I stepped back from the rail. The corridor was still silent, turned. And the 11 people behind me were all looking at me. Lena Voss, with an expression I had not seen on her face in 14 months of working in the same building, which was the expression of someone who has encountered of someone who encounters something that has made their entire framework feel small, defeated by it, not diminished. Simply aware suddenly of scale. Benedict was pale. Crystallographer from Copenhagen was holding his lens assembly with both hands, and was not, I was quite sure, thinking about crystal structures. I said, I should finish the wipe. I didn't get to complete it this morning. No one said anything. Turned back and reached across the rail, and finished what I had started. The upper section, the apex, 3 careful passes with the cloth, while the glyphs held their light and the channel maintained its deep green wave, and the people behind me remained very quiet. When I was done, I stepped back, folded the cloth, and put it in my bag. Lena Voss came to stand beside me at the rail. She was looking at the glyph band. She said, "Do you know what it said?" "What it means," I said. "I think so," she said. "What does it mean?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Dagny telling me on my first day that my job was the corridor, not the beacon. I thought about Haraldson saying it doesn't matter. Go ahead. I thought about the reports I had read over the years. The epistemically sealed language, the non-responsive conclusions, the theoretical frameworks, quietly abandoned, I said. I think it means that someone built that thing a very long time ago, and they didn't build it to respond to instruments. They built it to respond to the thing that instruments can't measure, and they expected to wait. Lena Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And that thing is what? What did you do that we didn't?" I looked at the beacon. The glyph band was holding, calm, still, luminous. Channel light was steady. The apex point was bright and patient, the way a lighthouse is bright and patient, the way the aurora is bright and patient, the way anything is bright and patient that has been doing its work for a very long time, without requiring acknowledgement, I said. I kept it clean. She looked at me. I said, "For 19 years, every month. I came down here and I made sure it was looked after. I made sure the temperature held. I made sure the seals were right. I made sure the air was clean. Not because anyone told me to, not because I thought it would do anything, because it was there, and it was my responsibility, and that seemed like enough reason." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The builders of an 8,000-year-old alien beacon included, in its recognition criteria, 19 years of an Icelandic maintenance worker cleaning it with a microfiber cloth," I said. "I think the 19 years were just the most recent part of it. I think the recognition criteria was the fact of maintenance workers at all. The fact that humans kept coming back to it. The fact that we didn't leave it alone in the ground. We brought it up, and we put it in a building, and we kept the building, and we cleaned the building, and someone in that chain of keeping, at some point, maybe many points, cared enough to clean the thing itself, to put their hand on it, not to take something from it, just to take care of it. She was looking at me steadily. I said, "You've been asking it questions for 8,000 years. Or people have. That's what all this has been. A question. What are you? What can you tell us? What will you give us?" And it has sat here for 8,000 years not answering, and everyone took that for silence. But I don't think it was silence. Think it was waiting. Waiting for someone to stop asking and start keeping. Lena Voss turned back to the beacon. The glyph band was still there, patient and bright in its ring around the upper housing. After a moment she said, "What do we do now?" I picked up my maintenance bag. I said, "I have the upper corridor vents to check before 9. I left her standing there at the rail with the beacon's light on her face and went about the rest of my day. The Kelder Annex issued a statement 2 days later. The beacon had produced its first registered response in recorded history, they said. The response included an optical emission pattern, a glyph sequence not yet decoded, and an audio output, 6 words in an unidentified language. The glyph sequence was being studied. The audio output had been recorded on 4 separate devices and would be analyzed for phonological and structural features. The cause of the response remained under investigation. They did not mention me. I was in the audio recordings, of course. You can hear, if you listen carefully, in the moment before the beacon speaks, the soft sound of a cloth on metal. No one has mentioned that in the published materials. That is fine. I did not do what I did for a mention. What I want to say, what I am trying to say, in this record, which I am writing in my own voice because no one else has thought to ask for it, is that the beacon was waiting for something that most people, looking at an ancient alien artifact, sealed in a sub-basement for 8,000 years, would not think to wonder about. It was not waiting for a credential. It was not waiting for a signal. It was not waiting for a theory to be correct, or a protocol to be right, or an instrument to find the right frequency. It was waiting to be cared for. Do not know who built it. I do not know why they built it, or what it was designed to do, or what the glyph sequence means, or what the 6 words mean, in the language they were spoken in. I do not know if there are others. I do not know if it will say anything else. What I know is what it said and what it named me. Not a scientist, not a scholar, not a title I had studied for, or a credential I had earned through any formal process. A keeper, the simplest kind of title, the oldest kind, the kind given to the person who showed up and did not leave. That is what the work was. That is what it had always been, in this corridor and in every corridor before it. In every place where an ordinary person shows up in the morning and keeps the thing running and asks nothing from it and expects nothing of it and simply does not leave. We are a species that keeps things. We keep light burning in places no one is watching. We oil the hinge and replace the seals and wipe the surface clean and write the temperature in the notebook and come back the next Monday and do it again. We do not do this because we expect acknowledgement. We do not do this because the thing is going to wake up one day and say our name. We do it because the thing is there, and we are responsible for it, and that is enough. The beacon is still glowing. Lena Voss and her team are still in sublevel 3, working through what it means. The glyph sequence is still being studied. The 6 words are still being analyzed. I still have the corridor. I was there at 5:45 this morning. The floor needed doing.